Hi, I'm Tim Bowness, and you're listening to the Progcast.
Welcome back to the Progcast. I'm your host Dario, and as you heard, with me today is Tim Bowness out of the UK, I guess. Thanks for being on the show. How are you doing?
My pleasure. Yeah, and it is the UK for definite.
Yeah, okay. This is episode 70, and Tim has a new solo album coming out, and that is on August 28th, which is the day after this episode gets released. Yeah, and we're gonna talk about this, of course. But we like to start our show with a little section that we like to call "What's in Your Walkman." Now, I'm pretty sure you don't listen to music on a Walkman anymore. But I'm pretty sure you're listening to some music every now and then. So I'd like to know, what has been in your playlist recently?
What has? Oh,
It could be anything. Could be something super obscure, something old, something new, something popular, something prog, something not prog, something whatever you want. And if it's on Spotify, we'll put it in the playlist that will accompany this episode.
Well, crikey, I always listen to quite a lot of music, actually, new music, old music. In terms of Walkman, I did buy relatively recently because No Man released a cassette last year, and I realized I had no means of playing a cassette. So I bought a new style of Walkman. So in fact, the only thing that's ever been in my Walkman is the latest No Man album from last year. But
all right.
In terms of how I listen to music, weirdly, I still buy CDs, I still buy vinyl. And I use kind of streaming mostly to either discover things or just a kind of a quick refresher. But, knowing what streaming is kind of doing to the music industry and just being a lover of physical formats and losing myself in artwork and lyrics, I still regularly buy CDs and LPs. In terms of what I've been listening to lately, which is your question, which I'm avoiding.
You're very good at that.
I'm very good at avoiding questions, yeah. There are so many. I've even got on my table in front of my record player quite a lot of things there. So let me try and remember rather than look on my computer or go over to that pile. A new album by Nadine Shah called Kitchen Sink, which is very interesting. Thundercat's new album, It Is What It Is, which I think is very beautiful in parts. Jack Hues has released a great double album called Primitive, which I suppose has a certain kind of progressive bent. And Roger Eno and Brian Eno's new album, Mixing Colours, I've been listening to that, which is very beautiful and very calming and great music for the apocalypse. And I've also been listening to a Mott the Hoople box set. So Mott the Hoople were a kind of 60s, 70s British rock band. And they were kind of interesting because they sort of straddled everything from hard rock to country rock to progressive rock to glam rock. And David Bowie famously produced them in 1972 and wrote a song for them. So they're sort of interesting as this hodgepodge of all things 60s and 70s in Britain. But their lead singer, Ian Hunter, is quite an interesting character.
All right. I just know the name. So I know them by name, but I never got around to checking out their music. And as you say, probably if you check out one album, it might not be what you will find on another album.
Absolutely. They did shift quite a lot. But there's a beautiful ballad called Sea Diver, which I'd recommend if you're having a Spotify. And then there's an epic track from their 1969 debut called Half Moon Bay. And that's really quite interesting. So what's odd about them is they sort of combined the lyrical qualities of somebody like Dylan with the rock qualities of, say, the Rolling Stones. But then they also had the grandeur of a band like Procol Harum.
Oh,
So
wow.
they had a lot of organ in the music. So it was one of those bands where what I love about early progressive music, I'm going to deviate now. What I love about early progressive music is that people were just making music, and it was from their imagination and from their eclectic tastes. And actually, they didn't know what they were doing. So, in a case like Mott the Hoople, they probably love Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Procol Harum, and soul music, and they put it together in a unique mixture. And of course, I think that's what a lot of the British progressive rock bands, and of course Italian and German progressive rock bands did in the early days. They like classical, folk, jazz, pop, the Beatles. They all love the Beatles, and with sheer imagination put together these amazing combinations of music, which is one of the reasons why I still love a lot of the early progressive music.
Yeah, that was actually a very nice episode or episode of our What's in Our Walkman section here, because
the longest.
I think we had longer, but maybe you can stay on the line later and tell me specific tracks for the other albums, which I can put on the playlist.
Okay.
Before we dive into your music, I also have 2 recommendations for the playlist that's been in my Walkman, so to speak. One is a solo EP from Between the Buried and Me frontman and singer who goes by the name of Thomas Giles in his solo work, and it's called Better Now, and it's a short EP. It's 3 tracks. It's electronic pop music. For people who are might be aware of Thomas Giles' solo work outside of Between the Buried and Me, they know it's not like frantic progressive metal with core influences, whatever. He's always been dabbling with avant-garde pop or something like that, and
sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's called Better Now, and it's just like 3 little songs, and they're just beautifully produced, and the middle song has like an electronic beat that reminded me of early Depeche Mode, and I was like, that might be the music that Depeche Mode could make nowadays if they would still make daring or interesting music, or like not play it safe,
No, I think I know what you mean. And I think, Depeche Mode, because for me with progressive, the spirit of progressive changes with each decade, or each half decade. And, certainly in the 1980s and early 1990s, Depeche Mode were a very progressive band. They were constantly challenging themselves and their fans and drawing in influences from industrial, from classical. I've got a lot of time for those. Certainly sort of Depeche Mode 1984, 1991, there's some great music there.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually it was kind of a connection in my head because the second track on your album is called I'm Better Now, of course. And so I was like, okay, there was this cool EP that was released earlier this year. And I thought it also fits your approach to progressive pop music, whatever. We're gonna talk about all this in a second. My second entry to the playlist would be from someone I'm pretty sure you know very well, and that's Evan Carson's solo album from last year.
Never heard of him.
It's such a gem. I love it so much. It's called Ochipinski for those who haven't heard it. It's one of the best albums from 2019, really. And when I saw that he's playing on your album, I just thought I have to give him one more shout out for this beautiful album with amazing guest contributions, most notably, of course, Gleb Kolyarin from I Am the Morning. But also Carl James Pesca on violin and viola from Arstidir, and Jim Gray from Caligula's Horse.
Yeah.
So yeah, and he's playing on your album, and that brings us to your new album.
Indeed, yeah. Evan's a great player. I mean, Evan's somebody I worked with originally about, gosh, when would it have been? A few years back, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I did a couple of co-headline gigs with I Am the Morning, and Evan was their live drummer. And I was so taken with his ability. He's such an original drummer, actually. And you can't say that very often about drummers, that they've got their own strong style these days. And what I love about him is he drives the music. He's got a real sense of groove and momentum, but he never overwhelms the music. He's always working for it. And we liked him so much that by the second gig, I got him on stage with us. And so he played the entire gig with my band. So we had a drummer and percussionist working against each other, and it was fantastic. And since then, I've wanted to use him on one of my albums. And luckily, a couple of tracks on this album just suggested his style, and he agreed. And with any luck, I'll be guesting on his next solo album that he's in the process of making as well.
Awesome. Yeah, one thing that kind of stood out when I was looking at your solo albums, for once, of course, yeah, you've been quite busy in the last decade. I mean, since Abandoned Dancehall Dreams, you've been quite constantly putting out solo albums. But in terms of like just looking at your solo albums, there was a big gap between the first one, My Hotel Year,
Yeah.
like 10 years, and then until Abandoned Dancehall Dreams. Yeah, how did that come about? How did you like start with it? I think Abandoned Dancehall Dreams is also considered like I've heard from various people who are familiar with your work that they particularly like this album and think it's great. So how did you come to kind of restart your solo career in 2014 then?
Well, it sort of started with No Man, really, because I'm in a band with Stephen Wilson called No Man, and we've been going for quite a long time. And No Man had released a studio album in 2008 called Schoolyard Ghosts, and that was written in a very different way from most of the No Man albums, because most No Man albums, it's me and Stephen together writing all the material. You know, it's No Man. But with Schoolyard Ghosts, that was written with me bringing in songs, either songs that I'd written entirely or I'd written with other people. And Stephen was coming in more as a producer in some ways. He was playing on everything and he was co-producing it with me. And Abandoned Dancehall Dreams started when we were talking about doing a new No Man album, because we'd done a No Man tour in 2012 and we'd played in Aschaffenburg, if I pronounce it correctly.
Aschaffenburg.
That's the one. As well as Cologne, I think. And so we'd had a successful No Man tour in 2012, and we'd really developed quite a unique band sound that's very different from our studio albums. And since Schoolyard Ghosts, I'd been writing songs and co-writing songs with No Man in mind. And so I brought them to Stephen, and Stephen at that time was just too busy. And he said, look, you know, you've written the stuff. Why doesn't it become your solo album? I'll mix it for you. And so I kind of took that as a springboard. And so I'd written the material for Abandoned Dancehall Dreams, you know, over a sort of a 5-6 year period with No Man in mind. So Abandoned Dancehall Dreams was very much my idea of what a No Man album should be. So it's my version. And luckily it did well. And I maybe excited by making the album and having a lot more autonomy, started working on stupid things that mean the world. And yeah, it sort of provided a springboard for a lot of writing and a lot of creativity. Whereas my debut solo album from 2004 that you mentioned never felt like a solo album, because what that was at the time I'd been writing with 3 or 4 different people, including a German musician called Markus Reuter.
Yeah.
And I'd been working with 3 or 4 different people on various albums, and they were getting nowhere. And so the first solo album, My Hotel Year, it was me putting together 3 tracks from this project, 3 tracks from that project, 3 tracks from that project, and just creating an album out of it. And so it never felt like a coherent album. Whereas, because I love albums, you know, I love the experience of being lost in an album, whether, you know, the artwork, the lyrics, and a kind of a flow that's intentional. You know, I've never got over falling in love with Pink Floyd when I was 11, you know, because Pink Floyd made the most beautiful albums. And
I think I had the same experience when I was 12, probably. With it was the Delicate Sound of Thunder version of Shine On You Crazy Diamond.
Okay. Well, interestingly enough, it was,
and that was in 1999 maybe. So
okay,
a couple of years after that came out, obviously. But yeah, I had the same experience. That's the sole reason why I'm sitting here today, and why I'm interested in this kind of music. It all started there.
It might be, strangely enough, it might be for me, because I think it was listening to Shine On You Crazy Diamond on Wish You Were Here that we had the music. You know, I think some friends had borrowed cassettes from their parents. And so we had all of these albums, you know, like Wish You Were Here and Physical Graffiti and Tubular Bells and what have you. And we liked all of them, but then Wish You Were Here came on, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and I was absolutely captivated. It was so beautiful. And so, yes, there you go. The same track, different album is why we're talking. And so My Hotel Year never really felt like a solo album or an intentional album, but Abandoned Dancehall Dreams did. And I also kind of put it down to the fact that about 9-10 years ago, I had a child. And when you have a child, it puts everything into perspective. You know, you feel your own mortality, you feel your own lack of time. And so basically, I think I've used my time more creatively and more wisely since having a child, because it makes you more aware of the passing of time and how important creativity and life is.
Wow. Powerful words. Let's look at another aspect that I kind of sprung to my eyes when I checked your solo albums over the last years. So all the solo albums up until now, you always had like a vast array of guest artists, actually guest musicians, that helped form the album in one way or another. And the new one, it's just 4 people, or like 5 including you.
Well, I can tell you with this, it was interesting because I think with every album that I make, I've got to feel that it's doing something different. I've got to feel that I'm ending up somewhere different with the music emotionally. And what had happened with this album is that I'd finished Flowers at the Scene this was the album that was released early last year. I'd finished it in 2018. Then I spent quite a long time with Stephen Wilson working on the No Man album, Love You to Bits. And that was basically kind of re-recording and rewriting and adding to a piece that we'd sort of originally started 25 years ago. So this was a piece that was a long time in the making. And Flowers at the Scene was quite a dynamic album. And Love You to Bits was even more dynamic. It was quite relentless and quite electronic and beat-oriented. And I'd actually not written a new song probably for about a year, because, you know, I don't believe in writing for the sake of writing or releasing an album for the sake of releasing an album. So it had taken me, you know, maybe a year for an idea, you know, other than rewriting bits on the No Man Love You to Bits album. And suddenly, very late at night, an idea came to me. I wrote it down. I sang it in the middle of the night while the family was sleeping. And it was a track called One Last Call. And it felt different to me. And it was just something in the use of the keyboards that I was going for, and the mood of it. And the next day I thought, this is the next album. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate on one particular mood and one particular approach, and almost examine that rather than the last few albums that have been quite dynamic and quite eclectic. And maybe it was because I'd just done this very dynamic album with No Man that I just wanted to retreat into something much more atmospheric. And so that's what happened with Late Night Laments. And going back to your question, what was interesting is that with a lot of albums, I wanted certain players to bring the music out or to add something to it. With this album, from the very beginning, everything seemed to work and everything was there. So One Last Call, that's what I want to do with the album. And then I with my co-producer Brian Hulse, I was writing, and he and I were writing in late 2019 and early 2020, really concentrated bursts of writing new material with this very focused end in sight. And I had the title Late Night Laments straight away. As soon as I'd done One Last Call, I thought, this is Late Night Laments. Pretty soon afterwards, I had the cover artwork. The cover artwork I outlined to my artist, Jared Gosling, probably December or January. I knew what I wanted. And in terms of the COVID mask that's there as well, I was very well aware of this happening from the first reports in Wuhan, because I'd followed this story from it being a tiny bit in The Guardian, being a 20th of the second page, to it being all 20 pages of the paper by late January, Yeah. And so this was in the back of my mind. And one of the things that also defines the album for me, there's a track called We Caught the Light, which I started to write on ukulele. And when I'd written this song, which was my first song written in 2020, in January, I had an overwhelming sense that this was not going to be a good year.
Oh my goodness.
And there was just a real sense of, I can't quite put it into words, but I felt a real need to finish this album. And I felt very strongly that something odd was happening and going to happen. And so, yes, this influenced the mood of the music and the mood of the cover. And going back to your actual question, for the first time since No Man's Together with Stranger, the demos just felt right. Whereas normally I might think, this demo, this is the basis from which to do a big production. I want Jim Mathias on this. I want a string quartet here. On this occasion, the pieces just seemed right as they were. And in fact, on a couple of occasions, I did add bass and I did add string quartet. And I thought, you know what? It ruins the song. And that happened with No Man's Together with Stranger, where Stephen and I finished it. It sounded great, but we added a few things, brass instruments and drums, and then we just took them off. And so that's what happened with this album. There probably were about 10 people on it, but gradually they got whittled down and down until it became the demo again, almost.
All right. That's very interesting. Like a very completely new approach, as it sounds to me, like you just described. You mentioned your cover artwork artist, and that was also is of course something that you will see when you look at all your solo albums, that they share the same visual language. So maybe you want to say a few words about your go-to cover artwork artist.
Well, Jared Gosling, he's an interesting guy. He's somebody I kind of met about 10 years ago, and he was in an electronic band from Sheffield, and he wrote to me because he wanted advice, because he was in a band called I Monster. I think he still is in I Monster, who'd had a top 20 hit all over the world with a kind of a chill out dance track in the early 2000s. But Jared's real love is progressive music. And so he wrote to me at Burning Sheds saying, look, I've got this album. Have you got any advice for it? I'm known as an electronic DJ and producer, but I just want to make prog. And so I really loved his artwork, really loved his music because it's very imaginative. And when I was doing my solo albums, I felt that I wanted a really distinct visual identity that was different from No Man, different from what I'd done before. And Jared is just a really skillful painter and has a style that was so removed from anything I'd used before. So with Abandoned Dancehall Dreams, I consciously went with something different. And since then, I've carried it on because I think, as you say, there's a language to the covers. And I think that with the best covers, like Abandoned Dancehall Dreams and Lost in the Ghostlight and Late Night Laments, they almost act as a window into the music. That I think all of the themes of the album, this isn't a concept album, but it's conceptual in that it's got a similar feel throughout. And I think that cover says everything, because what you've got is the person in their favorite comfy chair in their living room, listening to their favorite music with all of their books, records, CDs, everything that they feel defines them around them. And then in the background, you've got 24-hour news spewing out the global tragedies. And so you've almost got somebody trying to lose themselves in this world of beauty, this world of art. And in the background, reality is coming up to you and slapping you in the face. And with the album, I wanted to create this kind of late night feel of something that's quite woozy, quite seductive, quite beautiful. But if you burrow down into the lyrics, there are a lot of global themes in there. You've got hate crimes, you've got generational divides, you've got people randomly going mad and committing murders. It's actually lyrically quite serious, while superficially, I think it has a sense of calm. And that's what I think the cover also depicts, that somebody's there in their serene world, but you can see the global crisis in the background.
All right. Yeah, you seem to anticipate a lot of my questions, which is very cool. So I don't really have to ask them.
Sorry.
But one question I really need, I don't need to ask, but I want to ask. I'm curious about you. About your thoughts about genre definitions and where you see yourself as an artist. Like you said, you love the early progressive music, but with your own music, it's not like you wouldn't fit in the like the term prog music is used nowadays. Your music wouldn't necessarily fit there. So yeah, what's your take on genre definitions, and where would you place yourself in your music?
It's really difficult because with very few exceptions, I don't think I've ever made genre music. You know, what I do is very instinctive. It's quite emotional. It's quite instinctive, and I follow my instincts. And as the album years, which is a podcast I've got with Stephen Wilson, shows, I've got very eclectic tastes. You know, from very early on, the first music I ever loved was film music. So, you know, I love film music, classical music, folk music, jazz music, prog, electronic, pure pop, R&B, soul. You know, I follow whatever I think is interesting, and my own collection is very diverse. And with one or two exceptions, which I'll mention, I've never really dipped into a genre. You know, No Man, we got signed in the early 1990s, and we were signed, and it's bizarre to think of this now, as a kind of indie dance band. Stephen Wilson and I got signed in Britain and America as an indie dance band in the era of the Happy Mondays, Stone Roses, the Charlatans. And this is because we used dance beats at that point in electronics. But our music always drew from all sorts of people and styles. So I don't know, you know, I hope that what I do is distinctive and personal. The exceptions to this are Lost in the Ghostlight, which was drawing from certain traditional progressive elements, and that's because that was a concept album about a person who had been in an underground band in the 1960s, 1970s, had success. So deliberately, the music occasionally echoed some of the progressive vocabulary. Outside of that, I've had a side project called Henry Fool, where I play guitar rather than sing. And Henry Fool was deliberately created as an outlet for some of my ridiculous instrumental ideas, which were more in a kind of 70s jazz or progressive rock territory. But even then, I think it's as close to post-rock, Sigur Rós or Godspeed You Black Emperor, as it is to Genesis or King Crimson. So yes, I don't know, I don't know where you'd place my music. I suppose emotionally and spiritually, it comes more from a particular type of British music in the 1980s where you had Talk Talk, Blue Nile, David Sylvian, which then maybe evolved into things like Massive Attack and Portishead with the trip hop movement, and perhaps even artists like Bjork. No Man was signed to One Little Indian, which was Bjork's label.
Yeah.
And an album like Vespertine by Bjork, I suppose, is in a similar emotional territory to some of what I do. American bands, I'm a huge fan of Mercury Rev and Flaming Lips, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And they almost create a sort of contemporary indie psychedelia. And there are things in their textures and their music I like a lot. But I honestly couldn't tell you. I just kind of make music that hopefully satisfies other people, but it interests me, and it comes out of me quite instinctively. It's a terrible answer.
No, not at all. I mean, it would be very boring if you said, well, my music, the genre of my music is this and this, and that's it.
Well, also we shift from genres, because obviously, my last album, Flowers at the Scene, was quite dynamic and worked in quite a number of musical territories. This is much more focused in a kind of melancholic electronica. But the No Man album was almost like a progressive disco epic. It was a bizarre fusion of disco and soul elements, but with a scope and an eclecticism which suggested progressive music.
Yeah.
So, it varies. And I think the thing is with this, that now I've done an album that is very emotionally focused, it's likely I'm going to do precisely the opposite with my next album.
All right. Yeah, but you already touched a bit on your collaboration with Steven Wilson, of course, or various collaborations. Actually, I from my Progcast co-producer and sometimes co-host Randy Amsalo, for my last birthday, I got a nice little book that is called "Time Flies: The Story of Porcupine Tree."
Yeah.
And I think there's the author also did some interviews with you, and at the very beginning there's also some stories about how you guys met at the end of the 80s already. So that's been quite a few years back, and that I've been wondering what's your take on how the music industry changed, or the environment for alternative or independent artists like you, and for better or for worse, I don't know.
It's
first, for taking Corona out of account, I mean, the industry changed a lot in the last 20-30 years, I guess, but of course mostly in the last 20 years with all the streaming coming up, and you already touched on that subject at the very beginning. What has changed for you, and how does it feel to be an artist in this new
age? Well, it's changed an awful lot. When I first started, when I was a teenager in the 80s, although there was less music TV, less music radio, there was actually more diversity, if this makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Where I lived, I used to live between Liverpool and Manchester. And there used to be 2 radio stations on each of those. There were 2 Liverpool stations, 2 Mancunian stations. And after 6 o'clock at night, the DJs were free to play what they wanted. And that music was incredibly diverse, from indie to progressive to soul, you name it. People were just playing what they loved. And this now sounds bizarre, but major stations, I used to go up as a teenager with my cassette, and I'd go up to them and say, "Excuse me, sir, would you please play this?" And they would play my cassette. So it would be almost like, here's the new Kate Bush single, Running Up That Hill. And now here's a piece by Tim Bowness. Da, da. And it was unbelievable. DJs were approachable. This was only like 1985, 86, 87, you know?
Yeah.
And they were very approachable. They were very enthusiastic. On TV, we had 2 music programs. One was The Tube, one was the Old Grey Whistle Test. And they would have anything. They would have the chart-topping artist. They would have King Crimson. And they would then have whoever was fashionable that week. Frankie Goes to Hollywood. It really drew on everything. So when I was younger, you were exposed to so many types of music. And one of the great ironies since the 1990s, really, is we've suddenly got 24-hour music channels galore, 24-hour radio channels galore, digital music channels with the advent of the internet. And everything is stripped and streamed. So Manchester and Liverpool now have about 10 or 20 radio stations per city.
But they all play the same.
Well, this is it. True. 10 of them play the same top 20 playlist, day in, day out. 3 or 4 of them are all talk. They're talk radio.
Yeah.
And then the others will just play soul, jazz, indie. They're all stripped and streamed with, and there's no kind of eclecticism or drawing from things. And ever since, so that's changed and it's worse. So what's bizarre is, when I was an unsigned teenager, I could get my music on major radio stations by major DJs. Now, when I'm signed and I actually sell a fair bit and have an audience, I can't get on anything. You know, Stephen gets number 3 albums that are in the top 3 in the charts and cannot get played on anything.
Yeah.
Because it's very genre specific or chart specific. It's become much more limited. There are exceptions. You know, there's Radio 6 in Britain, 6 Music, has got a DJ-led, more eclectic musical policy. So there are a few, but you know, we're really talking about very few exceptions in this contemporary world, which is weird, given that we've now got more possibilities for this to happen. Yeah. So that's one thing, that weirdly, the ability to get music listened to by a wider audience has all but disappeared. You know, we all exist in ghettos. And I'm lucky, you know, going back to one of your original questions about prog, partly because, you know, I'm a huge fan of a lot of the prog innovators. I'm honoured that the prog community has taken my music to heart. You know, that to me is important because the prog audience is quite open-minded. The prog audience loves music. So as much as I might think a lot of my music isn't obviously prog or isn't even prog, I'm really pleased that the prog community's taken it on board because it's a good audience. But this is it. It's in a ghetto of a prog community. There's a ghetto of a prog community, a ghetto of a metal community, a ghetto of an indie community. Yeah. And even within metal, you've probably got death metal, hair metal, black metal, and so on. It's become so separated. And streaming has exacerbated things in a way because obviously it's not... I don't think it encourages deep listening. I think when you've got all of the world's music at your fingertips and it's streaming like water, you maybe don't give it the time and attention you would in the era when you used to buy things or absorb things. So maybe it doesn't encourage deep listening. And so for me with streaming, and obviously we know about the financial model, how it benefits the tech companies, and it benefits Daniel Ek, but it does not benefit the musicians themselves.
Yeah.
And I think, there can be serious repercussions relating to that. But, luckily, in terms of how things have affected me, I've been quite lucky in that maybe because I established myself originally in the 90s, I still have an audience that wants to buy what I do. So I'm lucky in that I still sell a fair few CDs, LPs, and that there's a market for what I do. But I'm aware of how rare that is these days in some ways, and feel, again, quite honoured that that's the case. But yes, I think that if I were an up-and-coming musician now, I don't know what the hell I would do. It would be bewildering.
You're amazing. I was just waiting for an opening to ask you the question, is there any advice you could give to young aspiring musicians?
Well, I suppose the advice would be now, whereas at one point, it would be pursue your, it still would be pursue your music honestly and then see where it fits. What I do with my music is this. I have to produce what I believe in and what I love. Then when I've done that, I'll try and sell it as hard as I can. I'll try and make sure it reaches a market as much as I can. But the music itself is paramount, and you've got to believe in it. So I think once you've created something that's yours and you believe in it, I guess unfortunately now, you've got to find out which radio stations, which online magazines would have an affinity with it and target this. Because again, generally it doesn't work. Whereas even local newspapers in Britain would have articles on local bands. Now, even your local newspaper in Britain gets a report that comes to them from London about Kanye West or Beyonce.
Yeah.
It's bizarre that the number of avenues that a young band has got to get any exposure is less than it was in the 1980s when there weren't hardly any avenues.
Yeah.
Because people aren't interested. Things have become centralized and things have become a lot less diverse, which is very odd. And, again, I don't know what chart music is like in Germany, but chart music in Britain, through streaming, they found that actually the top 20 at one point was virtually immobile. It wasn't changing week after week after week after week. And it was a remarkably similar style of music. Album charts, you can still get shocks where, Dame Vera Lynn might go in at number 5 as a result of VE Day, or Judas Priest's new album may actually hit the top 10 because they've still got a core audience.
Yeah, in Germany would be, Steven Wilson or, I don't know, Dream Theater or Devin Townsend or
exactly
bands like, I don't know, Nightwish, Sabaton, or you name it. Like these bigger players in progressive rock metal or also like mainstream metal, I don't know, Amon Amarth or whatever they called, they would pop up in the album charts, of course, in the top 10, the bigger players, but the top 10 or top 100 single streaming is a lot of that stuff is quite unlistenable for me, I have to admit.
Well, it's certainly something that, I think Stephen and I have talked about this on the album years, that we feel less connected to contemporary pop music. There is a great deal of good music out there in many different genres. So, I do feel there's some great music being made. So it's not a criticism of music being made at the moment, but in terms of what's actually reaching people, it does seem like one of the most boring and samey periods of history we've ever been in musically. And streaming's contributed to that because, of course, it is going to be somebody listening to that novelty chart hit 200 times on their phone. And of course, we also know one of the things that I remember saying in the early days of streaming was, well, actually, couldn't record labels manufacture a hit? And indeed, they found out that in America, there were streaming farms where basically companies have been paying people to stream particular things again and again and again in order to get them noticed and in the chart. And which is like payola in the old days of records, when people used to pay to get things played on the radio and in the charts. So yes, it does seem, I really wish I could be a little more optimistic on it, but the optimism is that you're still doing this show. I'm still able to make my music, and there are still people out there who, because of the internet, are prepared to look outside of the norm. And so, yeah, I think, if you're curious, there's always that possibility to find music. My son, when he was 2, discovered the Beatles, and he absolutely adored the Beatles cartoons on YouTube. This led to an obsession with the Beatles, which eventually led to him looking at interviews with McCartney and Lennon about their influences. And so he followed it through to rock and roll, which then led to rockabilly, which even led to country and Western music, things that I hadn't introduced him to, but that he had followed through a logical path. So, technology can provide you with ways to experience music and culture that isn't obvious, isn't a done deal. So in that sense, the internet is great because it's the library of all things. But what's funny at the moment is that we are finding that despite having more 24-hour media, less things are being covered. And it's an unusual phenomenon, really.
Yeah.
As we said, from local papers to local radio stations, it's bizarre that they're not celebrating difference. It's almost like we're all joining in on the same party.
Very interesting thoughts there. And but as you said, the internet can be also like the library of many of all things almost. And it's just a matter of how you are willing to use it. And you also mentioned it a couple of times throughout this podcast that you yourself started a podcast with your friend Steven Wilson back in May called The Album Years. And there's 9 episodes right now. How did this podcast come about? And maybe you can give a quick pitch of that.
Well, this came about because Stephen contacted me really as we knew the lockdown was about to be announced. It's a funny thing because I finished my album, by the way, on the day that lockdown was announced.
Oh, right.
And I was very lucky because I couldn't have made it after that point because we've had to deal with homeschooling, all sorts of issues. But anyway, Stephen had decided that he was going to cancel his album. And again, relating to Late Night Laments, I was worried. I thought, well, actually, will Late Night Laments have to be cancelled? Will it be irrelevant? Because everything seemed unimportant in the face of the virus.
Yeah.
But what's interesting for me is that as the pandemic's gone on, a lot of the themes I was talking about, hate crimes, generational divides, and so on, have actually become more prominent in the news than they were before. So that was an unusual thing for me. But for Stephen, because I think his album, The Future Bites, was kind of about consumerism, it suddenly seemed completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
And so he decided to wait. So he'd basically postponed the release of the album. So he phoned me and said, look, do you fancy doing a podcast? So for about 2 days, we just bandied ideas about. And the notion is that we're going to give back to music what music's given to us as music fans. And he came up with the idea of the podcast. I came up with the idea of the album year's title. And together we came up with the format. And it's been enjoyable. So basically we take a given year, because albums to me are still an important artistic statement, like a novel's an artistic statement. I still love the album, and so does Stephen. And so basically we kind of plucked years where we thought this was a great year for the dominance of the album and the importance of the album. And we talked about it across genres. And we tend to concentrate on albums that aren't necessarily the biggest. So although Dark Side of the Moon is probably my favorite album of 1973, we don't really discuss it because everybody's discussed it.
Yeah.
But we do discuss Judy Sill, Heart Food, which is a beautiful singer-songwriter album from 1973 that not very many people have heard of. So it tends to focus on lesser known albums, though we will occasionally mention big commercial albums, because sometimes the very big commercial albums people don't talk about because they're just there. You know, they're just known. So, so we've discussed Fleetwood Mac, for example, So that's what it is. We discover the music. We discuss the music in any given year.
Yeah. So is there any plan on like a kind of release schedule, or do you rather do these sporadically when you get time, or?
It's sporadically, really. It's kind of we just kind of come up with the year and then say, right, are you free on Tuesday? And we do it then. But we're both quite ruthless. I mean, the one thing that's good about, I've always loved working with Stephen because I'm quite perfectionist and I'm quite ruthless, but he's even more perfectionist and ruthless. And so the two of us, we will talk for 4 hours and then we will just cut, until we've said what we wanted to say. But it's been, it's been very enjoyable, and it's led to us listening to a lot more music as well.
Well, the inception of this podcast with my buddy Randy M. Saylor was kind of similar, but we like to keep it as uncut as possible. So
Right.
we just had this little connection hiccup. Of course, I'm gonna edit this out, but otherwise, this conversation will go up as a whole,
unedited. Good grief! That'd be tragic. You'd be sued.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of interesting topics over this. Just short of an hour right now. Your new solo album, Tim, is coming out on August 28th. It's called Night Laments, and it features Richard Barbieri, Colin Edwin, Kavus Torabi, and Evan Carson, as we established at the very beginning of the episode. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you on the show.
My pleasure.
Good luck with the release of the album. I'm looking forward to listening. Firstly, more of your back catalog, because I still have a lot of discovering to do. But also
it's fairly diverse. Yeah, that's the thing. I think that basically most of my albums tend to be a reaction to what's gone before. So they're either a contradiction of what's gone before or a continuation. And so there are quite a number of bases that the music covers, from Henry Fool, which is instrumental and quite complex, to Late Night Laments, which is much more atmospheric and melancholic, and perhaps is a more spiritual album. Because that's the thing, if we ever talk about our favorite albums, mine come from two extremes, and you've either got that extreme of people like David Bowie, where they constantly reinvent themselves and stamp their identity on what's going on in the outside world, or you have people like Talk, where they're producing albums that are very inward, where they're just, in a sense, responding to their own emotions, their own tastes, and creating an almost spiritual music. And so I think my music does go from extremes of attempting to sort of grab what's outside and stamp my personality on it, or evoke what I'm feeling internally.
Great words again. And to finish my sentence, I'm also looking forward to listening and discovering more older albums that you guys are talking about on your podcast, The Album Years, because I thought this was a really cool format, and it also, as you said, you're digging up some obscure gems that not many people might have heard of, including me. So that's also a cool way to discover more music that's new to us but has been out for a long time already. I'm looking forward to all this if I find
if
the
you
time.
have the time. Always difficult.
Thanks for being on the show. That was Tim Bowness. As always, thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and listen to great music.
The Progcast is a production of Stuus Media and is recorded at the Moonbase Studios in Munich. It is produced by Randy M. Salo, Janine Stengel-Lewis, Blake Lewis, Kai Metzner, and Dario Albrecht. Our theme music is by This Is Not an Elephant.